seminar, and it was 4. I think many people want to come here, but because they have been to the event this early afternoon. So many thanks for coming. In particular, some people coming to the talk already, and you as well. So I would like to give a brief introduction about Can Rivers Publishing. So since 2014, we start to have the first major event at King's College. It was Xu Zhimo and his life in Cambridge. And we use some of the materials, his manuscripts and other papers in the King's Archive. And that exhibition was very well received. And some of you have been to that event, may remember that. And that is 11 years ago, when I was pregnant. And during the end of the banquet, we had a poetry reading, and people enjoying it very much. They said, how about you have a poetry and art festival, poetry festival next year? And then I talked to several sponsors. They said, oh, very few people would like to sponsor a poetry event, but if you have art, it's different. So we started to have the Poetry and Art Festival since 2015. So in the past 10 years, we run over 10. We host over 15 exhibitions in the chapel and art room at King's College. Every year we have poetry reading and also seminars. I think every year there the major guests coming here to join the event. We invited about more than 100. The hall was always quite full. So about 2016, we decided that we are going to set up a publishing company to publish the catalog and anthology of the event. So that is the beginning of the festival. And then Alan wrote a lot of books, and we always think about how to publishing these books. So this good idea has been supported by many people, and by Alan, by Sarah, and by various fellows of King's. So after 8 years, we have about 20 people in our team, the editors, graphic designers, and also coordinators. They will always have some young helpless interns. There are some of them here. And so today we are going to have the book launch for another of Alan's book, and talk about the China's past and the future. And this book is quite special because Alan, we always find very interesting projects. We don't have much kind of other publishing company. We have under the pressure of where this book could be popular. So we run a lot of kinds of educational program and also guided tour in Cambridge to get funding to support the publishing. So we can publish whatever we like. And we'd like to support very interesting books that may have very small kind of readers. But some of our books are very popular. And this book is quite special because Alan found this book 3 years ago, right? And he realized that very few people, even many Chinese people, they don't know this book. And he said, how about we publish? I said, of course, Alan, whatever we write, we are going to support. So that is the beginning of the book. So Alan, would you like to start your introduction about this book?
Yep.
And also this book is special because I think Alan combined a lot of his own travel experience in China. It's like a kind of comparative ideas and dialogue with a person in the 18th century, 19th century. Yeah. So I'm going to return this to Alan.
Right. So, sorry. Right.
To thread that up again.
Cool. So what we've got to be out of this room at about 10 to 6, and we'll go
next door more or less to the wine room, and then there'll be wine and we can go on talking. So it'll be in two parts. That's because our busy provost, Gillian Tett, always does about 25 things at the same time, and today among the 25 things she's doing is at 6 o'clock she's welcoming the new students to King's in this room, so that's why we have to whiz out. She'll hopefully be here at 5:30 if she can escape from Yuval and Harari and other guests and Lord Brown and whoever else is whizzing around this Provost Lodge. And so you're all very welcome there. And I also ought to mention that this is one of a series of book launches that we're having. And next week, slightly earlier, 4:30, we're very pleased that Rob Foley, who is there at the back, will launch his book, which has broken all the copyright we have on the King's College Chapel by having a cover where it's converted into a set of flats. So it's called From the Ivory Flats or From Ivory Flats. Anyway, it's a brilliant analysis of what's gone wrong with higher education in the last 20 years. And you could map it on to the National Health Service or any of our other institutions, the bureaucratization, the Americanization, the business school models, etc. So that'll be here at 4:30 next week, this time. The other thing I'd like to say is that this is also a sort of slightly Cam Rivers Publishing, which is our company event, because we have Ella, who's one of our new members, John over there, and returned from the dead and also known as Taiwan is Maddie here, who worked with us for some time. And there are other friends, Sir Charles Chadwick Healy, who was a great sponsor and support in earlier incarnations, the Vanishing Worlds Foundation and things which morphed into what we're doing now. So that mentions that Rob Foley is doing this. We had Charlie Loke, who's another fellow of the college. In fact, there are about 8 or 10 of the fellows of this college who are publishing with us. And this is because we're filling a niche, which is that nowadays when people retire at 65, 67, they've got another 20 years of life to fill up. Sir Charles himself has written a book or two recently. They fill it up with a nice book, but of course no one wants to publish it because they're not in the network and so on, or they're going to wait 5 years for the university press to publish it. So Cam Rivers Publishing helps a few people like myself and Rob and others to find a nice small publisher with interest and with contacts in China, so the books can often be published in Chinese as well. Cam Rivers Publishing is part of a much wider endeavour that Zilan and I particularly and others have been trying to do, which is to set up a bridge of understanding. The Provost was just talking just now about poetry for peace. You start talking about chip manufacture or spy planes or something with people, they get very anxious about the confrontation between East and West. But if you say what we're interested in is painting and poetry and opera and so on, then you can talk along the cultural bridge. So over the years we've had these festivals and we've been doing all sorts of things to try and promote an understanding between a college. This college is special because from the very beginning, in the late 19th century, Sir Thomas Wade, who did the Wade-Giles orthography, was the first professor of Chinese history at Cambridge, and he was at this college. He then passed his enthusiasm to Lois Dickinson, who was a friend of Ian Forster and was the man who invented the League of Nations, that is Dickinson, and invited Zhu Zhimo to this college. And when Zhu Zhimo came to this college, then it became well known that this college had an interest, and so other people like Xiao Chan, Ye Chun-chan, famous writers in China, they came to King's. And it then went out into academics here, like Mark Elvin or Rana Mitter or other well-known writers on China who were educated at King's. So we are a good place to have this bridge of understanding, and our press is a little bit part of it, and what I'm talking about is part of it. So, trying not to overlap with what I said before, what I thought I'd do is to explain why I wrote the book, another part of why I wrote the book, and just give you one or two funny stories from Huc, which may amuse you. And then we'll have a chance to talk in about 20 minutes, 15 minutes or so. As I mentioned before, I arrived with Sarah in China in 1996, but didn't really seriously go till 2002, and then we've been there more or less every year since then. And so it was my 60s, it was my last duchess, as they say. Japan, the Anglosphere, Nepal were my previous areas, but you have to keep moving fast if you're an academic and not get stale, so why not China? So once we've been there once, of course, we were hooked and have been hooked ever since. What I always wanted was to try and do what an anthropologist does, which is what I am, go to another civilization, understand something worthwhile about it, and then bring it back, explain it to people here. And usually you go to one village, but I rather rashly decided to go to a place with 1.4 billion people and try and do the same thing. And so my first attempt, as I mentioned before, was a book called Understanding the Chinese A to Z, in which I took the idea. I'd written a similar book called Understanding the English A to Z, pubs and cricket and all that. And then, what about China? The only thing I wasn't allowed to talk about, I could talk about all the T's, Tibet and so on, but not Tiananmen. So the book is a long book divided into subjects, but as I mentioned before, it doesn't get the essence of China. Now, in order to do something which any normal anthropologist would think was suicidal, which is to try and do what they used to do in America with people like Ruth Benedict and Margaret Mead, write about the patterns of culture. What are the, in linguistic terms, what are the deep structures in Chomsky linguistics which generate the surface? Go down and find the rules, the grammar of the civilization. Now, that's not very fashionable, and it's something, but it's something I've increasingly wanted to do later in my life. And to approach this, you need to do various things. You need to travel a lot, and as I mentioned, I've travelled with Sarah all over China except in the northwest. You need to go with native speakers and people who know the culture very well, so when something happens and you're intrigued, you can sit down and have a Chinese meal and discuss what you've seen and so on. You need to keep very detailed diaries, which Sarah does, and notes, and film, which I do a massive amount of filming. So from 2002 to the present, we have got an archive of China as it changed over those 20 most significant years. And you need to analyse all those things. But another thing I found was that not merely through conversations with people now, deep, trusting conversations, but also with finding one or two people in that civilization, or who have lived there, who understand it and can explain it to you. They're probably dead. As I mentioned before, if you want to understand America, there's only one book, Democracy in America by Tocqueville, 2 volumes. One of the great works of comparative civilization, which is still a picture of China over America now and what's happening there. If you want to understand Japan, as I did, I found Fukuzawa Yukichi, a great philosopher of modern Japan, who set up much of modern Japan, Keio University and so on. And I wrote a book about him. So I asked all my Chinese friends, who in China can I read? I asked Fei Xiaotung's assistant, he's the great anthropologist, his assistant, Chen Kang, and he said, well, you could read Torney's book on land and labour in China, or you could read Fei Xiaotung's book on the land. But, the little, Torney didn't know very much. So I kept this in the back of my mind. Some of them said, well, what about a great Chinese expert who tried to understand the West, like Liang Jichao or Wang Wei? But I read them, and they didn't really understand both civilizations enough to be able to synthesize it. So I was looking for such a person, and a person like Tocqueville. And I looked at various missionaries like Matteo Ricci, I looked at McCartney and other missionaries. And then, as I mentioned, I first read these wonderful travels. For those of you who weren't there before, Evariste Huc, I'll tell you about him. He was born in 1813 in France, educated in the great Enlightenment tradition of French comparative philosophical thought that gave us Montesquieu and Tocqueville and people like that. And then he became a Lazarist monk, and he was sent on a mission to China in 1839, went to Macau. And he stayed there for 14 years. He was there during the First Opium War and then the lead up to the Second Opium War and the Taiping Rebellion. And he didn't go native, except that he dressed as a native a lot of the time when he was travelling around. He became native in that he liked the people, he empathized, sympathized, and he became increasingly aware of the arrogance of the imperial nations, his own, France, and other nations which were predating then on China, particularly the British. And he set out to, after his great travel books, he travelled right across the Gobi Desert in winter, with one guide. Extraordinary journey. No European had ever done that, from the north in Manchuria to Lhasa. But he did that. Thousands of miles over winter with 2 camels and bandits and fleas and freezing, and God knows, it's an amazing book to read, very exciting, in 2 volumes, which made him famous. But then he was sent down the Yangtze because the Chinese ambassador said he might be a spy and he must be examined as he went down. So he went down the Yangtze. And in that second 2 volumes, The Empire of China, he mixed the travel, which is again exciting, with real analysis. He did a talk, in other words. He took every subject he could think of. In the previous talk, the provost said, can you think of anything that he missed, he didn't talk about? And I can't really think. Like a proper anthropologist, you're interested in everything, so he's interested in giving very good descriptions of Chinese language, how it works, Chinese government and how it works, Chinese commercial system, vast and complex, the Chinese monetary system, Chinese agriculture, Chinese philosophy, everything. Interspersed between floating down through the storms and the Yangtze, etc. And so as recently as 2000, during the first COVID lockdown, Sarah picked up this 2-volume work from behind her where we keep our Chinese books and started reading it and said, you must read it, which I did. and I realized it was the person I'd been looking for. He had all the qualities that a good anthropologist has. He was a very, very good linguist. He spoke all 4 languages, Tibetan at least well. He was empathetic, sympathetic. He liked the Chinese. He was involved with them. He was immensely curious. He had a photographic memory, absolutely, for conversations, for scenes, and so on. And he had a sense of functionalism in that he, the great period of my discipline, anthropology, was between the 20s and the 70s, the period I was trained, which was the functionist era. And what the trick the anthropologists did was to say, okay, they're doing mad things like witchcraft or foot binding or eating each other or something like that. We're horrified. But A, why are they doing it? What function? So a witchcraft is just a psychiatrist by other names. Their money is just like our money. They have stock exchanges, but they call it. So you see the functional equivalence across civilizations, and you become less dogmatic and superior. And this trick with the other one, which is the task of anthropology, is to provide a mirror for our own civilization. So they're doing this crazy thing I mentioned in the other talk, foot binding. Okay, so foot binding is horrible and should be stopped, etc. But we treat our own women, in the same humiliating and disgusting way by making them follow fashions where they have high-heeled shoes and wasp waists and corsets and pierce their ears and whatever it is. And he said, with another one, which is infanticide, okay, so female infanticides are not as common as the Westerners think, but there is quite a lot of it. But you go to the streets of Paris, you'll find they're littered with abandoned babies. There are whole hospitals for these abandoned babies. We throw away our female children too. Or opium, you know. Of course, we caused the opium problem largely, and we shouldn't be too sanctimonious about it. But he said, you know, opium is a real problem already in the West and in the future. But China will have its revenge on us because he didn't know about opioids and so on. They will then start selling us drugs. So we shouldn't be pushing that too much. So he used his book as a mirror for the West to teach us. And I'll give you a couple of anecdotes. And this, Jean-Michel would like this as a quasi-French, well, near France person, because it elicited the interest of the great French poet Baudelaire. He says, one day when we went to pay a visit to some families of Chinese Christian peasants, we met near a farm a young lad who was taking a buffalo to graze along our path. We asked him carelessly as we passed whether it was yet noon. The child raised his head to look at the sun, but it was hidden behind the clouds. The sky is so cloudy, said he, but wait a moment. And with these words, he ran towards the farm and came back a few minutes afterwards with a cat in his arms. Look here, said he, it's not noon yet. And he showed us the cat's eyes by pushing up the lids with his hands. We looked at the child with surprise, but he was evidently in earnest, and the cat, though astonished and not much pleased at the experiment made on her eyes, behaved with most exemplary complacence. And they asked around the villagers, and they brought a number of cats, and they found that what the Chinese observed, and I've never heard about before, is that a cat, and I'm putting out questions to cat lovers here, cat owners, a cat's eyes automatically get narrower as the light gets stronger, whether the clouds are there or not. In other words, in the middle of the day, they're just absolute slit, and then they gradually expand. so you can tell the time from a cat's eyes. And this is one of many sort of observational scientific discoveries of the Chinese, who are famous for these discoveries through observing nature very carefully. And Baudelaire read this, and he wrote a prose poem called L'Horloge, if I got the pronunciation right, L-H-O-R-L-O-G-E, the clock, where he looked into his lover's eyes and they indicated to him that she loved him just as. So he told emotions rather than time from his lover's eyes. Anyway, that's just another delightful one was that in China was filled with poverty and so on when he was there. So he saw destitute people all over the streets of China. In Beijing they had a vast hall which they turned over to the poor, and the poor came in and spent the night there. They gave 1/10 of a farthing as a payment, and so they came in, and there was lots of ducks' feathers on the ground, and they all slept. 20,000 destitute people or whatever. Now the problem was they started to freeze, it was very cold. So they made a huge blanket on top to cover them. Then they realized if they just dropped a blanket on someone, they would suffocate. So this blanket, which was let down by pulleys every evening, they made lots of little holes. So they would lay their head out of this blanket, and in the morning there would be a bell sounded, and they'd put their heads down and the blanket would go up in the air. So this was just another practical example. He describes wonderful geographical features, lakes, which were filled with floating islands made from bamboo, off which they fished and so on. I've heard about this later in places in Southeast Asia and South America, but I hadn't come across it at that time. Oh yes, I won't read it to you, but this is something that's an extraordinary event. He went to, in the middle of this march across the Gobi Desert, they went to a monastery, and lots of pilgrims were going to it, and they turned up, and he said, "What's this?" And they said, "Well, every year a very famous Buddhist monk will do a ritual, and everyone comes to see it." And so he went and sat in the front row to watch this. And the Buddhist monk sort of meditated and said mantras for a while. Then he took out a very sharp sword, slit open his stomach, took out the entrails, put them on his knee, and proceeded to answer questions. He was a shaman, in other words, he was, will my wife leave me, or will I become rich next year, or whatever. And after an hour or two of answering questions, he got the entrails, put them back in, got some of his saliva and a little bit of blood, pressed it over, and there was no mark. Now, I've told this to modern Mongolianists and others like David Smith or Rob Barnett. None of them ever heard of this, died out, but he said it was quite common in a number of. Many people would just say hocus pocus, mirrors, and all the rest of it. But Huc took it seriously, though he thought it was probably the work of the devil rather than of God to do such a thing. So, the last thing I want to talk about is one thing I learned from, a particular thing I've learned from Huc and been thinking about a lot. Orwell, as you know, had this phrase about he who controls the present controls the future, and he who controls the present controls the past, etc. So, manipulation of history for present purposes, and we're all subject to this all the time. As I was saying in the other lecture, our media is totally distorting our views of China and other civilizations the whole time. But in this case, What happened in China was that the young Chinese, all Chinese more or less, are educated to believe that they are modern. And they are modern because there's a huge rupture in Chinese history, either in 2011, 2016 with the founding of the Republic, or more so Chairman Mao. Chairman Mao got rid of all the olds. It's a new China. We have no contact with the old China. That's what all my Chinese friends think and feel. It's a double bind because on the one hand they're saying, you know, those old people have something to do with me. On the other hand, every sentence begins, as Confucius said, or have you read this Tang poem, or whatever. So the philosophy and poetry and art is still living entirely, but everything else is nothing to do with us. Now, I'd come across this phenomenon in England. My first and most famous book on the origins of English individualism was showing that the whole capitalist revolution put forth by my teachers and my contemporaries, R.H. Tawney and Christopher Hill and others, was a Marxist invention done in the middle of the 20th century, based on Russian models of what a peasant society was, and many of them were Russian scholars. So we'd invented the transition from feudalism to capitalism, and I exposed this. I found the same thing in Japan, that my Japanese friends are astonished by some of my work, and they said, Alan, you're saying that we Japanese have, are a continuous civilization. We were taught that we weren't born in the Meiji Restoration, 1868. But actually, there's something continuous. Now, when another member of our team, who was translating the book, Yu Chen, read Huc for the first time, she wrote me an email in August 2023 as follows: I am amazed again. I find myself marveling at the mystical, enchanted, bygone world of China you describe. A world so different from my present reality, yet it remains the unchanged, deep inside. So, I've always been an advocate for continuities of history, as was Tocqueville. So, deep inside the Chinese psyche, as in ours, we are a continuous people, which is why, for example, to be topical, Israel will never destroy Palestine, and America will never destroy all the countries it attacks, because they have a deep inside which you can pulverize on the surface, but will come back. So it's an encouraging message, and it's a surprising one, and it teaches me that all great civilizations, in Japan, the greatest Japanese philosopher of the 20th century, Maruyama Masao, called it the deep note, the basso ostinato, the reverberating note of a culture above which all the other music goes, but that does not change. So what Huc does, and I'll end here, what Huc does is give us the deep notes, the absence of God, no God, the absence of our form of democracy, the absence of a writing system based on letters of the alphabet, the absence of an imperialistic past. All these things are totally different deep notes to ours, but they now present a challenge whereby 1/3 of the world, anyway, which is deeply influenced by China, is, as I mentioned before, a tertium orbis, a third world, like Borges writes about, which stands, therefore, as a serious existential challenge to ours. And it doesn't just say we can make better electric cars than you. It says, look, we have a different way of solving human problems. Some of them may be not as good as yours, but some of them might be useful for you to learn. And so those are the sort of things I talk about in the book. Thank you. be chairing this.
No filming, okay.
So this is, we have quarter of an hour or so before. Your people are coming in at 6, aren't they, Gillian?
No, I have some people coming in now, so I'm going to have to slip out in a second. I'm sorry to go in and out. I've got one group coming in now, but I've got the students, so I have to do it.
5 minutes, 5 minutes
Meeting with
questioning.
They're not coming here.
Oh, they're not coming here.
No, they're not.
Okay, well, we'll,
Library and then next door. So,
So
you guys can be here as long as you want, seriously.
okay, well, we'll be here till the drink calls us at 6, okay? And then we can go on with drink. So,
Thanks our provost to giving us the opportunity to use this wonderful room.
It's the beginning of term, it's a bit like air traffic control. We've got lots of planes now in directions, so I have to go off a bit and meet all the undergraduates.
so Gillian, you're here at the moment. You asked a very good question last time. Have you got a very good question this time?
No, I don't know.
Well, I'll tell you what. You said to someone else, you were very sweet to me and said how terrific and so on, but you then said to someone else, I disagree with quite a lot of what Alan was saying, unless I misheard. And I know we do disagree on both America and China. Is there anything that you think I've got fundamentally wrong?
There were a few things I disagreed with, but I guess, the main area I disagree and, respectfully is one, I don't think it's correct to say that the West is dominated by evangelical Christian culture anymore. I think the root to that was actually, the Protestantism certainly had an impact, but I think that evangelical Christian culture is now a fairly minor part of the cultural fabric in the West today. And the second thing I guess I disagree with on a bit is Taiwan, but again, that's controversial, and I think other people should ask questions rather than me sort of, jumping in straight away.
You've got somebody...
Microphone.
Sorry?
Your microphone.
What about it?
Wait a minute. Fortunately,
Is it not working?
What's that? No. I just need to get it back off you so I can download the stuff.
Oh, right.
Okay.
We're not
Not
recording
recording
this.
from now. No.
They're
Okay, so Maddie's just come back, or the provost gone to, not to hear the answer, but Maddie's just come back from Taiwan. My answer to that question before was that China doesn't want to absorb Taiwan as long as it remains in a kind of younger brother, tributary state, galactic empire kind of model. But if it decides to clear off, then it will be worried about the example it creates, the huge and legitimate, as people say, if Russia was to put, who dare say it, missiles on Cuba, or, because if Taiwan went independent, they can not only just buy millions of American military arms, but they can legitimately have the American Navy posted in Taiwan, and it's not very far away, you can more or less see it. So they have reasons for not wanting Taiwan to be independent, but they don't have any reasons for invading it, and as long as it doesn't do that. You've just been to Taiwan. What's the feeling there at the moment?
I think it's a very mixed country. I think lots of people don't realise that maybe from the outside, that the population is so diverse there, and you have like a real diversity of opinions. So you have a lot of the people that came over, after the Second World War, might feel a much stronger affinity with China, but then you also have a much older population that's been there previously that have a less strong affinity with China. I think maybe that kind of diversity of a population isn't necessarily reflected in the coverage.
Yeah, and then the young have lost some contact with China.
Yeah, I think the young are feel much more strongly connected to a Taiwanese identity. But again, if they have parents that came over and after the Second World War, they'll feel a much stronger affinity to a sense of being Chinese, because their ancestors, it's much more direct. Can draw a much more direct line.
The second point about the evangelical Christianity is interesting because Max Weber's prediction was that religion would fade away in the light of rationality and science. And that was a prediction, and it seems to have worked vaguely in this country. But Jonathan, son of John Bull, in other words, America. My picture, and I don't go to America, but you've been living there, my picture, and I think Gerard may agree with me, is that this country is very, very influenced by evangelical Christianity. There may not be, I mean, there's a lot of other things, and there may not be huge numbers of them, but they're very powerful, and particularly in relation to Israel now, one of the most supportive lobbies for Israel, or the Zionists, are the evangelical Christians in America. Is that wrong?
No, it's correct, but there's three elements of that. One is the question of whether the evangelicals are a force politically, which they definitely are. And yes, they do support the Israel, they do support the Zionists. That's not universal, but they do. The second thing is whether you think that, you know, evangelical Christianity, and I'm surprised to use the word evangelical, because if you use Protestant Christianity, or if you use simply Christianity, I think the second point would be easier to argue, which is the degree to which it's changed or influenced our vision of what society and what governance is for a country and how you define national identity. Because actually I think the question of Protestantism and all the Weber arguments, all of the Protestant ethos, all of this idea of working hard and individuality, that for me is something that's very much found in Western culture, and I think it's very different from China. And I think your point is correct, but I would not ally that to evangelical Christianity in any way, shape or form at the moment.
Being deaf, I caught about 3/4 of what you said, so...
I'm sorry. I'm saying that I think your argument would be stronger if you took out the word evangelical.
Yes.
Okay.
And you talked instead about, you know, the Weber Protestant Christian ethos. It dates back several centuries and is allied with ideas about individual sin, individual relationship with God, a sense of democracy, egalitarianism, a sense of hard work, all the things that Weber spoke about as having been entwined with the concept of capitalism. That bundle of ideas I think is more defensible. But evangelical Christianity as I just simply don't think, I simply do not agree that that is a dominant shaping ethos
Well,
today. It is a political force, but not a dominant shaping ethos.
you're obviously right.
And it's quite different from the Protestant ethic.
One little fact that might be of interest, not even, I think prophets must know, but no fellows know, that Christianity, Protestantism, you know, the Protestant ethic and Protestantism, was born 250 yards over there.
Yes, I should go to the doorbell. This is my next group coming in. So, I do know that, yes, it was fascinating. Anyway, I'm going to leave you and love you and leave you. I'll see you guys.
Thank you, Gillian. So, when Luther and the Germans were reading the Christian Gospels in the native language and translating them into German and so on, building up to the break with Rome, their writings were banned in England, and so they tried to smuggle these writings into England. They couldn't get them through London and up the Thames because it was very carefully watched, so it didn't get to Oxford. But the fens here are a kind of network of small waterways from the Ouse here. So they smuggled up the German writings, unloaded them on the Battle of Kings, which was a port, took them to a pub called the White Lion. There's a blue plaque there, which was known as Little Germany, as it mentions there. And between about 1520 and 24, when the first Protestant sermon was preached in this country at Little St Mary's opposite King's, all these famous Protestants who were later burnt by Oxford, Tyndale and so on, Whitgift and the rest, discussed it and brought it. So, and then out of that they went to the Cambridge colleges, particularly the evangelical ones, Emmanuel and Jesus Christ, and then they took them to America, and then they got this, what Gillian's talking about, this kind of inward, hard-working, ascetic, all the stuff that we read about, and that would be an easier thing to defend in relation to what America is. But I think the evangelical, I mean, I don't know what you think, Sherrod, you know America, you've been there. Is there a wing of Christianity in America which is strong?
Well, obviously evangelical Christianity. No, what struck me, I spent 4 years in the British Embassy in Washington reporting on American politics, and what struck me was the sort of binary Manichaean approach, the belief that you could build heaven on earth, that the world was divided into good and evil, goodies and baddies, and that one dealt with evil either by crossing the Atlantic and leaving it behind, or locking it up in a supermax prison, or executing it, or bombing it, and that one, through the application of force or money, one could somehow build heaven on earth. And I saw this in Afghanistan with the chaplains, with the American military forces, who would tell the American soldiers that they were there to fight evil, and they were there to promote Christ. And I remember the US Marines, who failed spectacularly in Helmand, but had this tremendous faith in the power of money and violence to solve things. They had all these T-shirts made with the Nike, a spoof of the Nike, Helmand, just do it. And they were going to go in there, and they, of course they didn't do it at all. And I've always thought, as you know, Alan, that in politics and life and lots of other things, that applying what is called in logic the law of the excluded middle is so wrong that life is shades of grey. And I was saying to Maddie, and perhaps to you, there's a wonderful project just being launched about zeros with the University of Southern California, and I think King's College London, looking at zero-sum politics, which is exactly the wrong way to go about building a better world. You're completely wrong, I'm completely right. But there is something about the American psyche that believes you can build a perfect society.
Well, taking that further, I didn't discuss the deeper essences of this book, but what I've increasingly realized is that you can characterize Chinese philosophy and thought as opposed to ours very simply as that ours is binary. Ken here and I worked on computers, and the little I know about them, they were mostly worked on 0, 0,
Yes.
binary, back and forth. Don't tell me I'm wrong, Ken.
No, we did have some principles. Excluded middle, which we rejected, but still.
So this it's not Christianity that did that. It was the Greeks. The Greeks invented the concept of the excluded middle, that you either had to be this or that, and it fudges things. And then you get the syllogism, which tries to A equals B, B equals C, therefore A equals C, but you don't have it binary like this. So we are a binary civilization from Greek thought, enforced by monotheistic religions, and then now by modern technology. China is miraculously, from its birth, from the I Ching, is a quantum civilization. Schrodinger's cat is both dead and alive in China. If you'd said to them, can a cat be dead and alive? The Chinese said, of course you can, you know. Yin yang, and you move into each other and you blend, and so on and so on. So Chinese thought, and I think that's one of the reasons they're really good mathematicians in the quantum age now, and physicists, is they think that like that naturally. My friend Zilan here, when I face her with a problem, you know, shall we do this or that, she very often comes up with a solution which is neither this nor that, somewhere combining the best of both. And China, a lot of the time, is combining the best of the both, which is another thing I didn't talk about or in this. Another miracle of China. Not only did it have this economic miracle, the social miracle, the largest in history, but how has it absorbed China, Western civilization in such a short period so successfully. I mean, if you go to China and you look at not just the technologies, but the social institutions, the medical system, the legal system, and all the arts. Many of the greatest musical performers, as Sarah and I have noticed, are Chinese now. They absorb, and the language and so on. They have this ability to not reject and to absorb the best of things, as do the Japanese when they can. So binary as opposed to quantum, I think, is a very simple way of looking at these two civilizations.
Time to have wine.
One more question?
One
Anyone?
more question.
We've got two questions. Okay.
I would like to ask about this the innate nature of a particular culture. Does it evolve over time,
In China?
or actually generally?
Well, when I wrote about political development of England over the last 800 years or something,
Yeah.
or Japan, or China, there's an American blues song called The Changing Same. What happens is what the philosophers called the philosopher's shoe, or there are different metaphors. The philosopher's shoe is, you've got a shoe,
Mm.
it's made in
Yeah.
10 bits.
Mm.
This bit falls off.
Yeah.
Then a year later that bit falls off and you put another bit of leather on it and so on. 10 years after you've got the shoe,
Mhm.
all the leather on it is different leather. Is it the same shoe or is it a different shoe? And it's the same with the other metaphors, the Argonauts. The Argonauts, they get ships set out, go around the world. By
Yeah.
the time the ship comes back, people say, is this the Argonauts' ship? Or, because, the people are different, the ship has different sails and so on, but it's clearly the same ship. So a culture like China or us has the great ability to flexibly change. It's the same with Cambridge. That will be the last example. If you look at Cambridge now, as Rob knows, is entirely different from the Cambridge which Rob and I came to in terms of organisation and syllabuses and so on and so on. And yet it's the Cambridge we came to. And it's much deeper than that, because if you take 4 or 5 of the main features of Cambridge, which is the tutorial teaching system, which is the college system, and several others, these were invented 800 years ago.
Yeah.
So it's like the English language, as another example. Structurally, we speak Anglo-Saxon.
Mm.
Now we have a lot of French words and terms brought in, and there's some small shifts, but basically we speak Anglo-Saxon. So you have both multiple change going on at a gradual or rapid pace, but and this is the last thing, one of Tocqueville's great breakthroughs intellectually, I think, was when he came up with the concept of the point of origin.
Mm.
So if you want to understand any civilization, you go back to the point of origin. The point of origin of China, one of the great points is the first Qin emperor, 221, who laid out the political system and unified China. The point of origin of the English are the Anglo-Saxons who came with their thing. Point of origin of the Japanese is from the high shamanic mountains of China who came down into Japan. And so about half of what we are is explained, it's just like a genetic code, is very deeply historical, and both changes and remains the same. Okay. Reza?
Thank you very much, Alan. When you talk, sorry, I couldn't basically come back because there was another presentation, I had to join that, so that's why I missed the whole talk there. But what I remember basically from what you said in the other room about the structure, and it's true because Christopher Abbott, talks about the Chinese accounts, basically talking about the Mongols, And then putting all this together, it quite clearly shows that the mentality in China, as at least say in the political elite, was that from the Tang Dynasty that the power should be basically under one direction, which is very vertical, from the Tang Dynasty all the way to the Mongols, and these are the Mongols who come and make it horizontal. So it's like basically make it more, so there was only 3 say departments, always tendency was to make it under one department and then rule the country. So it's like one say one party, one country, something like that. But it's something historical. And I was thinking that, did I miss this historical context? That's why I don't understand it today. And that's why I call it always dictatorship, right? So that's quite a lot of things. But going back to this issue, Alan, how this book is received in China itself, the account of Huc.
How does
the account, the Huc?
Huc?
Yeah, it's how it's received in China itself.
Well, it isn't received because they don't know about it yet. I think Zeeland checked out the 2-volume Travels of Tartary has probably been translated into Chinese. As I recall, the Empire of China, the 2 big analytical volumes, haven't been translated. And even if they had, that'll have a different impact from an anthropologist synthesizing it and then adding modern reflections. Because what Huc does in the first 2 volumes is what we call ethnography. He describes what happened. Second volume, he does what we call anthropology, which he does comparative analytical synthesis. And so my book is drawing on the one part of what he did there. So who knows, it's up to my comrade here to make sure that some Chinese read it. And
we haven't done it, but we try to approach a Chinese publishing company to publish this.
Yeah.
But I think they may possibly,
publish it or not?
I don't know. I don't know.
Well, we know lots of
We know there are
publishers.
censors, to check.
So
I hope I should be fine.
the person who's come for the wine has just come.